All right. Well, welcome again to session 4 of our Grand Story of Scripture class. We're going to do just kind of a brief review of where we've been so far. We did a big picture overview of the entire story of Scripture in session 1, and then we started going back through in more detail with sessions 2 and session 3. So we made the case that the Bible begins, well, first of all, we made the case that the Bible tells one unified story. It's 66 books written over hundreds and hundreds of years, but that are all telling one true, good, and beautiful story. And like all stories, you can kind of follow these certain movements of the story. And the first movement of the story is what we call the exposition. That's where we get the setting, the when and the where of the story. That's when we begin to meet some of the main characters, especially the main character, the protagonist, often called the hero of the story. And so I would love to hear from y'all for a minute. What do y'all remember about the exposition of the biblical story? So for example, where do we find the exposition in the biblical story? Like if I was going to read in the Bible the exposition, where would I turn to? Genesis, right? The beginning of the book, right? The Bible begins where all stories begin, in the beginning. And those are actually the first 3 words of the biblical story, in the beginning, found in Genesis chapter 1. And what did we learn? How would you describe what's going on in the kind of the beginning of the story? Creation, right? How did creation happen? Yeah, by God, right? So in the beginning, the next word of the biblical story is God. So we meet the main character, we meet the protagonist, we meet the hero of the story, literally in the 4th word of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we said that God's purpose in creation was to establish a kingdom on earth, a physical kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. What else about the exposition? Yeah, willed by God into existence. And what was God's greatest creation? Humanity, right? And the Bible, the Genesis account says that that humanity was uniquely created in God's image. And we said that to be an image means to be a representation, that humanity's purpose in God's kingdom is to represent him and to help co-rule his creation on earth as it is in heaven. That's the exposition. That's the beginning of the story. And how wonderful would it be if the story just ended there, right? But that's not where it ends, right? So if you're watching a movie or reading the book, the first chapter or the first few minutes of the book, you're getting a layout of the story, the when, the where, you're meeting the main characters. And it's not long before a problem is introduced. We call it the conflict of the story. Often, though not always, introduced by a personal antagonist, kind of the bad guy or the villain of the story. Okay, so where do we find the conflict in the biblical story? Yeah, there's a lot, right? Right? Because we're going to see a lot throughout the story. What was, I guess, the first one? Where did all the problems? The garden, right? But immediately followed by Cain and Abel, right? So yeah, there's multiple, right? But it goes back to Genesis 3, the temptation in the garden, where God's enemy, Satan, comes as a serpent and tempts the man and the woman. And instead of submitting to God and representing God, they instead submit to the serpent. And from Genesis 3 on, we have this cosmic war between Team God and Team Satan. And so creation, which was created good and beautiful and joyous, is now broken and fallen, and there's suffering and pain and hurt. And humanity continues in their rebellion against God, which we see in the very next chapter with Cain and Abel. And we see it on and on and on and on and on. So we have this good beginning that's interrupted by the conflict in Genesis 3. And then the last week, we began the longest part of the story, which is called the rising action, which, as we've just said or alluded to, there's this ongoing tension between these two sides. In the biblical story, that's between Team God and Team Satan. And so there's this, sometimes it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, right? And that's why, usually if you see the plot line of a story in a graphic form, it'll normally kind of look like this, right? It's kind of this back and forth as these two sides are waging war together. And so last week, Pastor Stephen took us through the first part of the rising action, which is the rest of the book of Genesis, from Genesis 4 through Genesis 50. And what do y'all remember about the main story points from the rest of the book of Genesis? How is God going to restore his kingdom on earth?
He was going to fulfill the promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob by, he was going to fulfill that promise. Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt, and God did that to save Israel and save a lot of people. And through that event, Jacob, who was given the name Israel, and his 12 sons end up settling in the land of Goshen in Egypt, and are there until a Pharaoh arises who is unfamiliar with Joseph.
Yeah, absolutely. So God singles out this family, starting with the man Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, who gets renamed Israel, and then his 12 sons, that God's kingdom restoration plan is going to come through this family. And he promises Abraham, he makes a covenant with him. We call it the Abrahamic covenant. And you could summarize the promises that he made to Abraham and his family in 3 words. We said land, seed, and blessing. And by the end of the book of Genesis, we're seeing the tiny little glimpses of these promises be fulfilled, but there is much yet left to be fulfilled. And that's where we're going to pick up the story today. So in today's lesson, we're picking up with the rising action, and we're going to go through the other 4 books in what we call the first 5 books of the Bible. In the Hebrew tradition, they're called the Torah or the Torah. In the English tradition, going back to the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, we call them the Pentateuch, penta meaning 5. So the first 5 books of the Bible, often called the 5 books of Moses, because Moses was the primary author of them. And you could summarize this chapter, you could title this chapter in the story as God calling out and constituting his kingdom people. In this chapter, God calls out and constitutes his kingdom people. So, as Ramsey just explained to us, you flip the page from Genesis, the next book you get to is Exodus, a few hundred years after the events of Genesis. And on the positive side, we read that God's people, the people of Israel, have been fruitful and multiplied, that they've grown and grown and grown and grew and grew. There we go. No, I said half. So they've grown and grown and grown and grown. There we go. All right. So God's people have grown. And just to reiterate something we talked about last week, Michael Vlock says in his book, He Will Reign Forever, that God's kingdom plan involves the establishment of a nation, specifically the nation of Israel, that would be the means through which universal blessing would occur. And as we get to the middle of the book of Exodus, which we'll come back to in a minute, God says that the people of Israel are supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And so what is a priest? A priest is a mediator between God and humanity, that they speak for and they act on God's behalf towards the people, but then they also act on the people's behalf towards God. That the people of Israel were supposed to be a kingdom of priests. They were supposed to mediate God's blessing to the nations, to all the nations, and likewise, they were supposed to point all of the nations to the Lord. Another analogy that we could use, I think Pastor Stephen used this last week as well, that the kingdom of Israel, the people of Israel were supposed to be like the beachhead of God's kingdom restoration mission. So just like in World War II, for the Allies to retake Europe, it started with D-Day, right? They had to take and establish this beachhead from which they would continue on this mission to restore Europe. In a similar way, Israel is going to be God's beachhead to restore his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. So they've been fruitful and multiplied. That's good. But we have a couple problems. One problem is they're still in Egypt. They're not in the promised land. The promised land was to stretch from the river of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. They're not within those boundaries at this point. And to make matters worse, Pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph, the text tells us. And so the story of Exodus is about God dramatically rescuing his people, Israel, from slavery in Egypt through events like the Passover and the parting of the Red Sea. Now, the parting of the Red Sea is probably the event that's more familiar to us. Even if you're still relatively new to the scripture, you probably at least have heard of the crossing of the Red Sea. But really, for the Israelites, though they would recall that event in their history as well, really the main salvific event in the history of Israel was the Passover. That Moses went to Pharaoh again and again and again, asking him to let the Israelites go. And he refused. Sometimes he would say, yeah, you can. Actually, never mind. The final thing, the thing that it took for Pharaoh to finally let the people go was the 10th plague, the plague of the firstborn. But God gave a way for the Israelites to be saved from his judgment, that they would sacrifice an innocent lamb in their place, and that they would paint the blood of the lamb over their doorposts, and God's judgment would pass over the people of Israel who had acted in faith. And this was the main salvific event in the history of Israel. And they would recall it year after year after year with the feast of the Passover in a similar way that we in our worship services, as we'll do here in just a little bit, week after week after week, partake of the Lord's Supper, which not coincidentally, the Passover meal and the Lord's Supper are intimately connected. So God dramatically rescues his people from slavery in Egypt, and he establishes a covenant with them. So we have the Abrahamic covenant that we learned about from Genesis chapter 12 and 15 and 17. And in Exodus, we get the beginnings of what's called the Mosaic Covenant. This one's called the Mosaic Covenant because it was mediated through Moses, who was the leader of the people of Israel at the time. You'll also hear it sometimes in the New Testament just referred to as the law, and that's just kind of a shorthand for the Mosaic Covenant. It also comes to be known as the Old Covenant. And another word for a covenant is testament. So that's where we get the language of Old Testament from, because it's about the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Covenant. Now, how do the Abrahamic covenant and the Mosaic covenant relate to one another? Well, I think a good analogy is the Abrahamic covenant would be like a father's unconditional love for their son. Pastor Stephen talked with us last week, or taught us last week, how the Abrahamic covenant was what we call a unilateral covenant. It was just God making promises to Abraham, period. Doesn't matter how bad he and his family would screw it up, God is going to fulfill his promises. So it's like a father's unconditional love for his child. The Mosaic covenant would be like the house rules in the family. So earlier this morning, your opening discussion question was about rules that you had in the home growing up. So a famous story from the Perez family, especially when we were more actively involved in foster care. We had Bernard in our family, age 4 at the time, and then we were fostering a set of twin 4-year-olds at the same time. And so we affectionately referred to the 3 of them as the triplets because they were so close in age. And as you can imagine, having 3 kids in the home period, but especially 3 4-year-olds, life got pretty crazy. Okay. Now, it didn't matter how they acted. We loved them, whether they were a permanent member of our family or just in our family for a season. We loved them unconditionally, but we had to establish some house rules. And so Jennifer got a big piece of poster board and wrote out family rules. Some of them are family standard rules. So the very first rule was treat others the way you wanted to be treated, right? An appropriate rule, especially for a Christian household. We want to be kind to one another. We want to, be gracious towards one another, things like that. There was also rules like you don't throw toys, right? Should be self-explanatory, but sometimes you got to spell it out a little bit more specifically, right? We don't throw toys, except there was one main exception. The basketball you're allowed to throw because that's what you do to play basketball. So otherwise, though, unless it's a basketball, no throwing toys. There's the universal rule of keeping your hands to yourself, right? So keep your hands to yourself. We needed that one. That was a good one. There was listen to the grown-up, okay? There was listen to the grown-up. So for Bernard, we're mom and dad. For our foster twins, we were auntie and uncle. So You got to listen to the grown-up, okay? And then the favorite one, the last one is don't mess with the dog. So we had to establish these family rules, right? And even if they broke these rules, it didn't mean that we loved them any less, but it did mean that there might be some consequences that came with breaking the rules. So that's how the Mosaic Covenant worked. The Abrahamic Covenant, God's or a father's unconditional love for their child. The Mosaic Covenant, like house rules, doesn't change the father's love for their child, but it does mean that there's going to be some consequences for breaking those rules. Another way to think about the Mosaic Covenant, this again comes from Michael Vlock. The Mosaic Covenant was like the national constitution of the nation of Israel. So just like our country, the United States of America, the official founding of our country came with the signing of the Constitution. That is what made us a nation. So in a similar way, the Mosaic Covenant functioned as the national constitution for the nation of Israel. And then furthermore, it is how the nation of Israel would image God. That the nation of Israel is carrying on this calling that was originally given to all humanity to be image bearers of God, to represent God. The Mosaic Covenant and the laws and regulations and rules that came with it are how the people of Israel would image God. It is how they would represent God. In the Reformed tradition, we say that the law had three purposes. The first one was to reveal God's character. So as we read the Old Testament law, we're learning about who God is and what he's like. And it's also how God's people were to reflect his character. Now, a misconception that often comes with the Mosaic Covenant is it is not works-based righteousness. We see throughout history the Israelites turn it into that, such as when Jesus comes on the scene several hundred years later and he's interacting with the Pharisees. They've made it a way they think that obeying the law is how they stand righteous before God. But that's not how the Mosaic law was intended to function. To quote Michael Vlock yet again, he writes, "The covenant was not a means for salvation. It was a gracious covenant given to a redeemed nation." So if you read the core chapters of the Mosaic Covenant are Exodus 19 and 20. If you read that, God is saying, I will be your God, period. And he says, I am the Lord who called you out of Egypt. Now, because of that, here is how you are to live. So Thomas Schreiner, a great biblical scholar, writes that the Israelites' obedience was meant to be a grateful response to Yahweh's love and grace. And so, of course, the essence or the most famous laws from the Mosaic Covenant are found in Exodus chapter 20, the 10 Commandments, or in Hebrew, it's the 10 words. And so the 10 Commandments can basically be divided into two groups. We call them the first table of the law and the second table of the law. The first table of the law, Commandments 1 through 4, primarily deal with how humanity and specifically the Israelites are to relate to God, to Yahweh. They're to have no God before him. They're not to make any idols. They're to honor his name, and they're to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. That's the first table of the law, how they are to relate to God. The second table of the law, Commandments 5 through 10, is how they were to relate to one another. Do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not covet, etc. So the 10 Commandments. And then the rest, when we encounter laws throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, throughout the rest of the Torah, they're really just further expansions and clarifications of those 10 Commandments. Basically, any law that you find in the Old Testament, you can point back to one of these 10 Commandments. And so Exodus begins with this great rescue from slavery in Egypt. In the middle of the book of Exodus, we get the establishment of the Mosaic Covenant. And the second half of the book of Exodus is the part of the book that most of us as Christians aren't quite sure what to do with, and maybe even, frankly, think is kind of boring, because the second half of the book of Exodus is the instructions and the construction of the tabernacle. It has to do with the tabernacle. In our textbook for this class, called Living God's Word, here's how they define the tabernacle and describe it. They say, the tabernacle was a mobile tent-like temple where God's presence will live. Let's think about God's original purpose for creation, going all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2. God's original design was for a kingdom on earth as it is in heaven, and he desired to dwell with his people on earth. And so sin separates us from God, but one of the things that the tabernacle was supposed to do is supposed to be like a hot spot of God's presence among his people. And that's why the climax of the book of Exodus, in Exodus chapter 40, after the tabernacle has been constructed, we see the glory come and fill the tabernacle as a miniature fulfillment of this great goal of God to dwell with his people on earth. That's the book of Exodus. Then we turn the page, we get to the book of Leviticus. And much of the book of Leviticus is what I mentioned a moment ago, where you get these like really granular, specific laws. Like what happens if a neighbor's donkey wanders onto your property, what you're supposed to do. And so it's further clarifications and specifications of the law found in the Ten Commandments. But here's a problem. How is a holy God supposed to dwell with sinful people? Because even though they've been given these rules, they have not been given a heart to obey them, that they're going to fail time and time again to perfectly obey all these rules and laws that God has given them. It doesn't change his love for them, but it does mean that there might be some consequences. So how can a holy God dwell with a sinful people? Well, the answer is the book of Leviticus. And primarily that answer comes in two interrelated forms. One is the establishment of the priesthood. We already talked about what a priest is. A priest is a mediator between God and man. So God establishes a priesthood for the nation of Israel, specifically Aaron, who's Moses' brother, and his sons, who come from the tribe of Levi, which is where the book of Leviticus gets its name. And so one answer to that problem is the priesthood, and then what the priests and the Levites would do, which is the sacrificial system. And the center of the book of Leviticus and the climax of the book of Leviticus is found in the Day of Atonement. And that's kind of a fancy theological word that we don't throw around much in our just everyday language, at atonement. But if you break down that word, atonement means at one ment. So sin separates us from God. It puts us at enmity with God. Atonement is how we are reconciled to God and how we are reunified with God. Specifically, as the book of Leviticus teaches, and as the Passover previewed, and we see previews of that even earlier in the story, through the sacrifice of a substitute on behalf of the sinful people. So that's the book of Leviticus. Then we turn the page and we get to the book of Numbers, which is frankly kind of a tragically lame title for a book of the Bible. The Hebrew title is much cooler. It's Bamidbar, meaning in the wilderness, because it's about the people of Israel's journey through the wilderness on the way to the promised land. As I've mentioned before, this is the book that I'm reading through right now with our children. And almost every morning begins with this kind of following exchange with me and my children. Okay, we turn to our new chapter in the book of Numbers. We say, okay, all right, kids, do you think the Israelites finally get it? Will they finally trust and obey the Lord? To which my kids, in unison, inevitably go, no. The book of Numbers is about Israel's failure time and time and time again, but yet God's faithfulness to not give up on them. But again, house rules doesn't change his love for them, but it does come with consequences. And so finally, it gets to the point where the Israelites absolutely refuse to go into the promised land. They're on the edge of the promised land, but they refuse to go in. And so God, as he often does in his justice, says, fine, have it your way. And so they are sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the original Exodus generation dies off. That it's going to be the next generation, their children, that get to go into the promised land. One final note about the book of Numbers is that there's this interesting story. You may remember the story if you grew up in Sunday school of Balaam's donkey. That comes in this has set of chapters in the book of Numbers where now the second generation is on the verge of entering the promised land. So the original generation has largely died off and they're on the edge. And the king of the Moabites is not happy. So he hires this prophet to speak curses against the people of Israel. And the prophet says, I can't speak but what the Lord tells me. And so time and time again, he can do nothing but bless Israel. And one of these blessings is he speaks prophetically. This pagan prophet speaks prophetically of a coming king who we know is going to be the capital S seed of the woman, the capital S seed of Abraham, this king that's going to come from the people of Israel, who's going to be the king over God's restored creation. And then finally, we turn the page yet again and we get to the book of Deuteronomy, which comes from Greek, which means second law. And so this is a re-giving of the law to now this second generation that's about to enter the promised land. And so it's why, for example, we get the 10 Commandments repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 5, even though we already had the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20, because it's a restatement of the law to the second generation that's about to enter the promised land. Now, one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible, certainly one of the most important chapters in the Old Testament, it comes in Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy chapter 28. It has a companion chapter at the end of Leviticus chapter 26, but Deuteronomy chapter 28 outlines the rewards for obedience and the consequences for breaking the house rules. That as Israel is faithful to the Lord and obeys his law, they're going to experience God's blessing, wealth, prosperity, family, fertile land, and on and on and on. As they are faithful and obey, they're going to experience rewards. They're going to receive rewards for their obedience. But conversely, as they're unfaithful, as they disobey the Lord, they're going to experience consequences. They're going to experience curses. It's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse until the worst punishment of all would be they finally will get kicked out of the land. But a couple of things to note about this. Number one, it's important to remember that as God tells them that they would experience these consequences, and as they, spoiler alert, over the course of their history, experience these consequences, the goal is always repentance and restoration, right? The way that we often say it in our household is, hey, look, you can either learn this the easy way or the hard way, right? So experiencing these consequences were meant to help teach the people of Israel, even if they had to learn it the hard way. And Deuteronomy 28 becomes the key interpretive grid for the rest of the Old Testament. That as you see the people of Israel, and they're either prospering or not, it all comes tied back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. So Deuteronomy 28 is one of the most important chapters in the entire Bible, especially in understanding the Old Testament. So the Torah, the Pentateuch, ends with Israel as a nation. They've been fruitful and multiplied. They now have a national constitution. They've been given a law, but they still don't have a land. They're on the edge of the land, but they haven't entered it yet. And that's where we're going to pick up the story next week. So now I'm going to turn it over back to your tables. You have a couple of discussion questions to help you continue to process what we learned about today. So I'll hand it over to your tables for discussion.